The sapphire necklace caught the candlelight like captured starfire, each facet trembling against Eleanor Whitmore's pale throat as she stood before 300 of England's finest. The ballroom of Ashworth Manor stretched around her in golden splendor, crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across silk gowns and jeweled waistcoats, the melody of violins weaving through whispered conversations, and the rustle of taffeta. Yet beneath the grandeur, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Eleanor's fingers found the cold weight of the heirloom sapphires, the same stones that had graced the throats of Whitmore duchesses for 7 generations. The same stones that had watched her late husband's cruelties, had witnessed the tears of tenant families turned from their homes, had been present at every decision that valued profit over human dignity. Her heart thundered against her stays as she lifted trembling hands to the diamond clasp. "I choose wrong," she whispered, her words somehow carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen over the assembly. 300 pairs of eyes fixed upon her as the Duke of Whitmore's ancestral necklace, worth more than most men earned in a lifetime, slipped from her throat into her waiting palm. The weight of centuries settled in her cupped hands. Corruption, cruelty, and wealth built upon the broken backs of those who worked the land. Through the crowd stepped Thomas Hale, his broad shoulders cutting through the sea of silk and satin like a ship through troubled waters. His hands, rough from honest labor and stained with ink from endless tenant ledgers, reached out as Eleanor extended the necklace toward him. Their fingers brushed for one electric moment, sending shivers through her that had nothing to do with the evening's chill. The ballroom erupted in scandalized whispers. "Madness," someone hissed. "Utter ruin," breathed another. But in Thomas's dark eyes, Eleanor saw something far more dangerous than society's censure. She saw respect, understanding, and the flicker of a love that had been carefully banked for years, like coals, waiting for air to kindle them into flame. She had taken a step no duchess was meant to take, crossed a line that separated her world from his, as surely as castle walls divided lord from serf. Her entire existence might crumble because of this moment, but as Thomas's calloused fingers closed around the cold sapphires, Eleanor felt something she had never experienced in all her years of marriage and widowhood. Finally, the choice was hers. Eleanor Whitmore had learned early that a woman's worth was measured in bloodlines and dowries, not in the quick intelligence that blazed behind her green eyes or the compassionate heart that ached for justice. Born Eleanor Ashcroft to a once proud house whose fortunes had dwindled like autumn leaves, she had been educated by the finest governesses her family could afford, which meant she could speak 3 languages, play the piano with skill, and quote Shakespeare while embroidering delicate roses on silk. What those governesses had not taught her was how to survive a marriage to a man who viewed his wife as merely another possession in his vast collection. The late Duke of Whitmore had been 20 years her senior when they wed, his grey eyes cold as winter stones, and his heart carved from the same unforgiving material. For 8 years she had played the perfect Duchess, hosting dinner parties where men discussed enclosure acts that would drive families from their ancestral homes, smiling prettily while her husband spoke of tenants as though they were livestock to be managed rather than human souls deserving of dignity. Her private journals, hidden in a locked drawer of her writing desk, told a different story. Pages upon pages revealed the guilt that gnawed at her conscience like a persistent wound, the longing for a life of meaning beyond the gilded cage of her title. She had inherited not only the Whitmore name upon her husband's death, but the crushing weight of centuries of expectation and the terrible knowledge of how that wealth had been accumulated. Thomas Hale remembered hunger as his first teacher. Born in a cottage on Whitmore lands, he had learned to read by firelight using pages torn from discarded books, his mother holding him on her lap as she traced letters with fingers cracked from washing laundry for the manor house. His father had been a good man, honest as the day was long, who had worked the same fields his grandfather had tended before him. That honesty had been his downfall. When the old duke had demanded impossible rents and created debts where none had existed, Thomas's father had spoken against the injustice. For his troubles, he had been thrown into debtor's prison, where fever had taken him within a month. Thomas had been 14 then, old enough to understand that his father had died, not from illness but from a broken heart and broken spirit. The local vicar, moved by the boy's fierce intelligence and hungering mind, had taken Thomas under his wing. Father Matthews had taught him rhetoric and philosophy, mathematics and history, nurturing a quick wit and natural leadership that might have made Thomas a scholar in different circumstances. Instead, his education had forged him into something more dangerous, a man of the people who could speak the language of power. As steward to the Whitmore estate, Thomas had managed the accounts with meticulous honesty, finding ways to be fair to tenants, while still maintaining the profits that kept the duchy solvent. He had earned respect among the working folk and suspicion among the nobility, a man who belonged fully to neither world, yet understood both intimately. The year was 1794, and revolution whispered across the English countryside like wind through wheat fields. In France, nobles had lost their heads along with their titles, and even in England, the Enclosure Acts were driving desperate families from their homes. Change crackled in the air, as dangerous and unpredictable as summer lightning. Lady Agatha Pemberton, Eleanor's dearest friend since childhood, served as the voice of aristocratic propriety. "Eleanor, darling," she would say, her fan fluttering nervously, "your charitable impulses are admirable, but there are proper channels for such things. One simply does not involve oneself directly with trade and tenant concerns." Lord Rutledge represented the old ways with his predatory smile and hounds that lingered too long when he kissed Eleanor's gloved fingers. Wealthy beyond measure and cruel by nature, he embodied everything Thomas despised about the nobility and everything Eleanor was expected to accept as her future. Mrs. Hale, Thomas's mother, still lived in the same cottage where her son had been born. Arthritis had bent her back and gnarled her hands, but her spirit remained unbroken. She watched Eleanor with the keen eyes of a woman who had served the gentry all her life and knew the difference between genuine kindness and patronizing charity. The divide between Eleanor and Thomas was not merely one of wealth or birth, it was an chasm carved by centuries of tradition, as wide as the distance between the manor house on its hill and the cottages huddled in the valley below. She represented privilege and decadence, though increasingly troubled by guilt over the source of her comfort. He embodied hard-earned knowledge and dignity forged in the fires of injustice, yet possessed of an innate nobility that had nothing to do with bloodlines. As pressure mounted for Eleanor to remarry, her steward warned of growing unrest among the tenants, and Lord Rutledge's interest grew more predatory by the day. Both she and Thomas found themselves navigating expectations as treacherous as a ship's passage through storm-tossed seas. Neither could have predicted that their separate struggles would soon intertwine their fates, as surely as ivy embraces an oak tree, or that love would bloom in the most unlikely of soils. Eleanor discovered the true extent of the estate's troubles on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning, when her current steward, a nervous man appointed by the Duke's solicitors, presented her with ledgers that revealed the depth of financial mismanagement. Tenants were months behind on rents they could never afford. Families were abandoning their homes to seek work in the factories of Manchester, and those who remained spoke in hushed tones of rebellion. "Perhaps, Your Grace," the steward suggested with trembling hands, "we might consider Lord Rutledge's offer to consolidate the management of these concerns." The thought of placing her estate under Rutledge's control made Eleanor's stomach turn. She had seen how he managed his own lands, with evictions and brutality that squeezed every penny from the soil and the people who worked it. There had to be another way, which was how she found herself standing before the modest door of Thomas Hale's study on a grey afternoon, her heart hammering like a bird trapped in a cage. The room she entered was a revelation. Where the manor's library boasted leather-bound volumes arranged more for display than reading, Thomas's study lived and breathed with purpose. Maps covered every wall, marked with careful notations about soil quality and crop rotation. Ledgers lay open on his oak desk, filled with columns of figures in his precise handwriting. Quills sharpened to perfect points, weighted in neat rows, and scattered among the practical papers were sketches, architectural plans for improved cottages, designs for better drainage systems, and tucked beneath a stack of correspondence, a detailed drawing of the Whitmore orchard in spring bloom. Eleanor lifted her chin as Thomas rose from behind his desk, his dark eyes wary. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broad beneath a simple wool coat that had been mended with careful stitches. His hair, black as a moonless night, was tied back with a leather cord, and when he bowed to her, the gesture held respect but not subservience. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying the educated tones Father Matthews had taught him layered over the accent of his birth. "I confess myself surprised by this visit." "I seek honest counsel, Mr. Hale," Eleanor replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the intimate atmosphere of being alone with him in such an unadorned space. "I am told there is unrest among the tenants. I am also told you are the cause of it." Thomas's jaw tightened, and she saw the flash of old pain in his eyes, the hurt of a boy whose father had died for speaking truth to power. "I am accused of many things, Your Grace. Sedition, agitation, corrupting the natural order." His hands clenched at his sides. "I stand guilty only of believing that a man should not starve while working land that feeds others, that a woman should not watch her children waste away because her husband cannot pay rent set impossibly high." The passion in his voice stirred something deep within Eleanor's chest. She had spent years listening to men discuss the tenant problem, as though families were mathematical equations to be solved rather than human beings deserving of dignity. "The estate faces collapse," she said quietly, moving closer to his desk where she could see the careful notations he had made. Each entry told a story. The widow Morrison behind on rent since her husband's death, but caring for 3 young children. The Hartwell family, whose cottage needed repairs that would cost more than they could earn in 2 years. The Baker's family, forced to choose between buying grain for bread and coal for warmth. "It need not," Thomas replied, his voice gentler now, "but truth is rarely comfortable, Your Grace, and the solutions will require considerable changes to how things have always been done." Eleanor studied his face, noting the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the calluses on his hands from work that went far beyond managing accounts. This was a man who had rolled up his sleeves and labored alongside those he sought to help, who had earned their trust through shared sweat rather than inherited authority. "I need your help," she said, the words emerging before she could stop them. Not as a duchess speaking to a tenant, but as one person to another who cares about more than profit margins and social expectations. For a long moment, they stood in silence, broken only by the whisper of rain against the windows and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Thomas's presence, of the way candlelight played across his features, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from his person despite the autumn chill. "You would face scandal," he warned softly. "The gentry will not forgive a duchess who treats her steward as an equal partner rather than a servant to be directed." "Let them whisper," Eleanor replied, surprised by her own boldness. I have lived too long caring more for their opinions than for what I know to be right. Thomas moved to the window, gazing out at the fields that held so many memories, good and painful alike. I will remain as steward, he said finally, but under one condition. You must be prepared to hear truths that may displease you, to make decisions that will turn your world upside down. I will not be party to pretty lies or gentle deceptions. As Eleanor prepared to leave, her gaze fell once more upon the sketch tucked beneath his papers, the orchard drawing with its careful attention to the play of light through apple blossoms. Something about it called to her, a whisper of memory from childhood visits to the estate before her marriage had changed everything. Thomas noticed her attention and quickly moved to cover the sketch, but not before she saw her own figure beneath the trees, captured with an artist's eye for detail and something that looked remarkably like devotion. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, her hand on the door handle, "that drawing, a foolish fancy," he interrupted, his cheeks darkening with what might have been embarrassment. Nothing more, but as Eleanor walked back through the rain toward the manor house, she carried with her the memory of Thomas's eyes when he thought she wasn't looking, and the dawning realization that this partnership might awaken more than just her conscience. The transformation began with morning rides through the estate. Eleanor's midnight blue riding habit, a splash of color against the autumn countryside, as she and Thomas surveyed fields and cottages together. Where once she had viewed her lands through the windows of a carriage, now she dismounted to walk through mud and stubble, learning the names of tenant families and the stories written in their lined faces. Mrs. Patterson has been trying to repair her roof with branches and old sacking, Thomas explained as they stood before a cottage whose thatch had been damaged in the previous week's storm. "She's proud, won't accept what she calls charity, but if we presented it as an investment in the property..." Eleanor nodded, already understanding his meaning. She was learning to navigate the delicate balance between genuine help and wounded pride, to offer assistance in ways that preserved dignity rather than diminishing it. Their evenings stretched long over ledgers and correspondence, the library transformed into a working space where Eleanor would roll up the silk sleeves of her gown to better manage the papers spread across the massive oak table. Thomas would arrive after his day's work, his coat still carrying the scent of fresh air and honest labor, and together they would pass through accounts and plan improvements that could benefit everyone. "Your husband kept separate books," Thomas told her one evening in October, his voice carefully neutral as he showed her a hidden ledger that revealed the true profits extracted from tenant labor, what the stewards reported to him and what he actually collected. Eleanor's hands trembled as she turned the pages, seeing the systematic cruelty laid out in neat columns of figures. Families charged for repairs never made, fines levied for imaginary infractions, rents raised arbitrarily whenever the Duke needed additional funds for his London gambling debts. "I never knew," she whispered, though even as she said it, she realized that ignorance had been willful. She had chosen not to look too closely at the source of her comfortable life. "Thomas, how can I ever make amends for this?" "By choosing differently now," he replied, his voice gentle with understanding rather than judgment. "By being the Duchess your people need rather than the one society expects." It was during these long conversations that Eleanor began to glimpse the man beneath Thomas's careful composure. He spoke of his father with a love unmarred by bitterness, describing how the elder Hale had taught his son to see dignity in all honest work. He revealed his own struggles with self-doubt, whether his education made him somehow less authentic in representing his birth class, whether his feelings for a woman so far above his station were a betrayal of everything he claimed to believe about equality. One rain-soaked evening in late October, a sudden downpour caught them inspecting the village school that Eleanor had decided to expand. The small building offered no shelter from the driving rain, and Thomas insisted on escorting her to his cottage rather than attempting the longer journey back to the manor in such weather. The cottage was smaller than Eleanor's dressing room, but it radiated a warmth she had never experienced in all her years at Whitmore House. A fire crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books, philosophy and poetry, alongside practical manuals on agriculture and animal husbandry. Thomas's mother, Mrs. Hale, welcomed Eleanor with the same courtesy she might have shown any guest, neither fawning nor hostile. "Sit by the fire, Your Grace," the older woman said, pressing a cup of tea into Eleanor's chilled hands. "That silk will be no protection against the damp." Eleanor found herself studying Mrs. Hale's weathered face, seeing strength there that had nothing to do with wealth or position. This woman had buried a husband, raised a son alone, and maintained her dignity through decades of hardship. When their eyes met, Eleanor saw something that made her breath catch: recognition, understanding, and perhaps even approval. "Thomas speaks of the changes you're making," Mrs. Hale said quietly, as her son hung Eleanor's sodden cloak by the fire. "The families are grateful. It's been many years since Whitmore cared more for their welfare than their own comfort." Thomas busied himself preparing fresh tea, but Eleanor caught the flush that colored his neck above his simple shirt collar. The cottage felt warm and alive in ways the manor never had, filled with evidence of lives lived with purpose and connection rather than mere display. As the weeks passed, Eleanor became increasingly aware of Thomas's physical presence, the way his hands moved with confident precision when he demonstrated proper techniques for testing soil quality, the unconscious grace with which he mounted his horse, the curve of his mouth when he smiled at something one of the tenant children had said. She found herself inventing reasons to stand closer when they reviewed maps, her pulse quickening when his sleeve brushed against hers as they worked. The attraction was not one-sided. Eleanor caught Thomas watching her when he thought she was absorbed in her reading, his dark eyes holding an expression that made her stomach flutter with unfamiliar warmth. When she stumbled on uneven ground during one of their inspections, his steadying hand lingered at her elbow, far longer than propriety demanded, his touch burning through the fabric of her gown. Their conversations grew more personal as autumn deepened into winter. Eleanor found herself describing the loneliness of her marriage, not the physical discomfort which would have been unseemly to discuss, but the spiritual emptiness of living with a man who saw her as an ornament rather than a person. "I used to imagine conversations with him," she confessed one December evening, as snow fell softly outside the library windows. "I would practice in my mind what I might say about books I had read, or ideas I had formed, but when I tried to speak of such things, his eyes would glaze over as though I were reciting shopping lists." Thomas set down his pen, giving her his full attention in the way that still surprised her. "What kinds of ideas?" he asked. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Foolish things, perhaps. I wondered why we could not establish schools for all the children on the estate, not just the boys. I thought about whether there might be ways to improve the cottages that would cost less than constant repairs. I even wondered," she paused, then continued in a rush, "whether the profits from our lands might be shared more fairly with those who actually work them." "Those are not foolish ideas," Thomas said quietly. "They are the thoughts of someone who sees clearly and cares deeply." Their eyes met and held, the space between them charged with possibilities neither dared name aloud. Eleanor felt her breath grow shallow as Thomas rose from his chair and moved toward her, his expression intent and wondering. "Eleanor," he whispered, her given name falling from his lips like a prayer or a confession. She stood as well, drawn by forces stronger than propriety or wisdom. They were close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His hand reached up as though to touch her cheek, and Eleanor felt herself leaning toward him, her lips parting slightly in anticipation of, "I must not," she gasped, stepping back so quickly that she knocked against the table edge. "You and I, it cannot be done." Thomas dropped his hand, his expression stricken, but understanding. "Forgive me," he said. "I should not have." "No," Eleanor interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do not apologize for something we both, for what nearly—" She gathered her shawl and fled from the library, leaving Thomas standing alone among their scattered papers and dreams. But even as she ran, Eleanor's heart raced not with fear but with the terrible, wonderful knowledge that what lay between them was far more than duty or friendship, and far more dangerous than either had imagined. The accusation arrived with the January frost, delivered by a contingent of soldiers whose scarlet coats stood out like blood drops against the snow-covered estate. Eleanor watched from her bedroom window as they surrounded Thomas's cottage, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Lord Rutledge had not come himself. Cowards rarely did their own dirty work, but his influence hung over the proceedings like smoke from a poorly tended fire. The charges were sedition, inciting rebellion among the tenant class, and correspondence with known radicals sympathetic to the French revolutionary cause. "This is madness," Eleanor declared to Captain Morrison, the officer who presented her with the warrant. "Mr. Hale is guilty of nothing more than performing his duties as steward with unusual honesty." The captain, a man whose youth made his authority seem borrowed rather than earned, shifted uncomfortably under her imperious gaze. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but we have evidence of treasonous correspondence." Letters in his hand, discussing plans to organize the working class, to redistribute wealth from its rightful owners. Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. She knew Thomas's correspondence. She had seen every letter he wrote regarding estate business, had helped compose several of them herself. But as the captain produced a sheaf of papers from his coat, she recognized Thomas's precise handwriting, discussing topics that made her stomach clench with dread. "The time has come for decisive action," one letter read in Thomas's familiar script. "The current system benefits only those who inherit privilege through accident of birth, while grinding down those who create actual wealth through their labor. We must move beyond mere reform to fundamental restructuring of how power is distributed." Another letter spoke of liberating resources currently hoarded by the aristocratic class and establishing true equality regardless of bloodline or inherited title. Eleanor stared at the papers, her world tilting on its axis. These were Thomas's words, his handwriting, his seal, but the ideas expressed were far more radical than anything he had shared with her. Had she misjudged him so completely? Had his gentle manner and reasonable proposals been a mask for revolutionary sympathies that could destroy them both? As news of Thomas's arrest spread, Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated. Lady Agatha arrived within hours, her face pale with social horror. "Eleanor, darling, you must distance yourself immediately," she urged, pacing Eleanor's drawing room like a nervous cat. "The entire county is talking about your association with this radical. Lord Rutledge has been very concerned about your reputation, very protective. He might still be willing to offer his protection if you act quickly to denounce any connection with treasonous activities." The suggestion that she throw herself on Rutledge's mercy made Eleanor's skin crawl, but the alternative seemed equally impossible. If the letters were genuine, if Thomas truly harbored revolutionary sympathies, then her public support of him could be seen as evidence of her own treasonous leanings. Yet doubt gnawed at her like physical pain. The Thomas she had come to know to love, though she had never allowed herself to use that word, seemed incapable of the cold calculation these letters suggested. His passion for justice burned bright and clean, but he had always emphasized reform through legal means rather than violent overthrow. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Hale, her arthritis forgotten in her distress, arrived at Eleanor's kitchen door on a bitter February morning, clutching a leather satchel against her thin chest. "Your Grace," the older woman said when Eleanor insisted on receiving her in the morning room rather than sending her away, "my son is many things, but he's no traitor. These letters," she opened the satchel with shaking fingers, revealing sheets of paper covered with Thomas's handwriting. "These are the letters he actually wrote. The ones they showed you. Someone has been very clever with forgery." Eleanor examined the genuine correspondence with growing fury. Thomas's actual letters to reformist groups in London were reasonable documents advocating for gradual change through legal means, parliamentary reform and education rather than revolution. Someone had taken his authentic letters and created forgeries that used his writing style to express far more dangerous sentiments. Rutledge, Eleanor breathed, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. She should have known. Who else had the resources to orchestrate such elaborate deception? Who else stood to benefit from destroying both Thomas and Eleanor's reputation for independence? But even as she recognized the trap that had been laid for them, Eleanor realized how perfectly it had been constructed. Her own aristocratic peers had watched her growing friendship with Thomas with increasing suspicion. Her defense of him would be seen as evidence of her own corruption rather than proof of his innocence. The social isolation was swift and merciless. Families who had called upon her regularly suddenly found themselves too busy for visits. Invitations ceased arriving, and when Eleanor appeared at church, conversations died as she approached, replaced by meaningful looks and barely concealed whispers. "You have become quite the topic of conversation," Lord Rutledge informed her during one of his increasingly frequent visits, his smile holding all the warmth of a serpent's embrace. "Society is concerned about your judgment. The influence of inappropriate companions can be so damaging to a lady's reputation." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, though inwardly she recoiled from the predatory gleam in his pale eyes. "And what would you suggest, my lord?" "Accept my protection," he replied, moving closer than propriety allowed. "Marry me, Eleanor. Let me shield you from the consequences of your charitable impulses. Your steward's fate is already sealed. There's nothing you can do for him now except ensure that his disgrace does not drag you down as well." The offer was presented as generosity, but Eleanor heard the threat beneath the honeyed words. Marry Rutledge, abandon Thomas to his fate, and her reputation might be salvaged. Refuse, and she would face ruin alongside the man she loved. That night, alone in her chambers, Eleanor wept over the sapphire necklace that had started everything, the symbol of hollow vows and inherited guilt. Her whispered words echoed in the darkness. "I chose wrong then. I must not now." But as dawn broke grey and cheerless over the frozen estate, Eleanor was no longer certain that right choices were possible when the entire world seemed arrayed against love and justice. Eleanor Whitmore had never addressed a gathering of magistrates in her life, but as she swept into the county courthouse on a bitter February morning, her black mourning dress transformed into armor and her chin lifted with ducal authority, she commanded attention like a force of nature. The assembly hall fell silent as she approached the bench where Thomas sat in chains, his face bearing the marks of prison life, but his eyes still blazing with unbroken spirit. Lord Rutledge lounged in the gallery, his satisfied smile faltering as Eleanor took her place before the assembled justices. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, I come before you not as a woman seeking favor, but as the Duchess of Whitmore demanding justice." The chief magistrate, a portly man who had dined at her table many times, shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, this is most irregular. The proceedings are based on forged documents," Eleanor interrupted, producing Mrs. Hale's leather satchel. "I hold here the genuine correspondence of my estate steward, Thomas Hale. What has been presented to this court as evidence of sedition is nothing more than an elaborate deception designed to destroy an honest man." She spread the authentic letters across the magistrate's bench, her movements precise and controlled despite the fury burning in her chest. Mr. Hale's actual words advocate for parliamentary reform and gradual social change through legal means. The letters used to arrest him are clever forgeries that use his handwriting style to express sentiments he has never held. "That is a serious accusation," the magistrate warned, though Eleanor could see uncertainty creeping into his expression as he compared the two sets of documents. "It is a serious crime," Eleanor replied. "One orchestrated by Lord Rutledge to eliminate a man whose honesty threatened his plans to acquire control of my estates through marriage." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Rutledge shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. "This is preposterous. Your Grace's obvious attachment to the accused has clearly clouded her judgment. She speaks from emotion rather than reason." Eleanor turned to face him, her green eyes blazing with controlled fury. "I speak from knowledge, my lord. Knowledge of your attempts to coerce me into marriage through threats and manipulation. Knowledge of your systematic corruption of tenant records and illegal seizure of common lands. Knowledge of the bribes you have paid to magistrates and officials to ensure favorable rulings for your interests." She reached into her reticule and produced a second sheaf of papers, correspondence she had gathered through careful investigation over the past weeks, using her social connections and family name to unlock doors that would have remained closed to anyone of lesser rank. These documents detail Lord Rutledge's various crimes, including his forgery of evidence against Mr. Hale. "I have testimonials from 3 separate writing masters who can attest to the deception, as well as evidence of payments made to certain officials to ensure swift conviction without proper examination of the evidence." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor could see calculation flickering behind the magistrate's eyes as they weighed the political consequences of their decision. Convicting Thomas based on forged evidence would be embarrassing enough, but ignoring the testimony of a duchess who clearly had evidence of broader corruption would be far more dangerous to their own positions. Through legal maneuvering that required every favor she could call in from her late husband's connections, and strategic use of funds that would normally have gone to new gowns and London entertainments, Eleanor secured Thomas's release within a week. She waited outside the prison gates at dawn, her heart hammering as the heavy doors creaked open and Thomas emerged, blinking in the pale winter sunlight. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the cobblestones, two people who had survived a trial that might have destroyed them both. Then Thomas walked toward her, his steps growing more certain with each pace, until they stood close enough to touch but still separated by years of conditioning and social expectations. "You came," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I promised you honesty," Eleanor replied, reaching into her cloak to withdraw the familiar weight of the Whitmore sapphire necklace. "I choose wrongly. No longer, Thomas, I choose you." She pressed the necklace into his hands, not as a symbol of her station but as proof of her commitment. Not as Duchess to Steward, not as superior to subordinate, but as Eleanor to Thomas, as a woman who loves a man worthy of her heart. Thomas's fingers closed around the cold sapphires, but his eyes never left her face. "Eleanor," he whispered, her name carrying all the longing and devotion he had carefully hidden for so many years. I love you beyond reason, beyond wisdom, beyond any consideration of consequence or propriety. When their lips finally met in the grey dawn light, it tasted of freedom and choice, and the promise of a future built on truth rather than tradition. Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, not her heart, but the cage that had surrounded it, releasing her into a life she had never dared to imagine possible. The kiss was witnessed by prison guards and early rising merchants, and by noon the entire county would be discussing the scandalous sight of the Duchess of Whitmore embracing her former steward outside the gates of the county jail. But Eleanor found that she no longer cared what society thought of her choices. Her defiance rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Tenant families who had watched her fight for Thomas began to organize for better working conditions and fairer treatment. Other progressive landowners, inspired by her example, began implementing reforms on their own estates. The careful facade of aristocratic unity began to crack, allowing space for new ideas about equality and justice to take root. Thomas accepted not merely her love, but her partnership, understanding that together they could accomplish far more than either could achieve alone. His bitterness toward the aristocratic class softened as he saw Eleanor's genuine transformation from ornament to advocate, while his passionate commitment to justice helped her find the courage to challenge systems she had once accepted without question. 3 years later, Eleanor stood in the orchard where Thomas had once sketched her in secret, watching their 2-year-old daughter chase butterflies among the apple blossoms. The child's dark hair caught the afternoon sunlight as she toddled after the dancing insects, her laughter bright as silver bells in the warm spring air. "She has your determination," Thomas observed, settling beside Eleanor on the stone bench they had installed beneath the largest tree. "Watch how she refuses to give up, even when the butterflies fly higher than her reach." Eleanor smiled, her hand finding his with the easy comfort of long companionship. Their marriage had caused scandal at first, 3 months of social isolation that had tested their resolve, but ultimately strengthened their bond. Gradually, however, the success of their reforms had spoken louder than society's disapproval. The Whitmore estates now boasted the most prosperous tenant farms in 3 counties, with schools for all children regardless of gender, improved cottages that provided warmth and dignity, and profit-sharing arrangements that ensured those who worked the land benefited from its abundance. Other progressive landowners had begun adopting similar practices, creating a quiet revolution that spread through reason rather than violence. Eleanor still wore silk gowns, though she chose practical fabrics that could withstand mud and honest work. Thomas still managed the estate accounts, though now he did so as co-owner rather than employee. Their partnership had evolved into something neither aristocratic tradition nor revolutionary ideology had anticipated: true equality between 2 people who valued each other's strengths and complemented each other's weaknesses. Lord Rutledge had fled England after his corruption was fully exposed, his estates confiscated by the Crown and distributed among his former tenants. Lady Agatha, initially horrified by Eleanor's choices, had eventually been won over by the evident happiness of the marriage and had become an unlikely advocate for women's education among her social circle. Mrs. Hale lived now in a comfortable cottage on the estate, her arthritis eased by regular medical care and her heart gladdened by watching her son's dreams fulfilled. She served as unofficial grandmother to little Margaret, named for the saint of outcasts and rebels, and often told the child stories of her father's youth that mixed truth with gentle mythology. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly, following Eleanor's gaze as she watched their daughter discover a fallen apple blossom and hold it up like a treasure. "The life you might have had if you had chosen differently." Eleanor considered the question seriously, as she always did with matters that touched their shared history. She thought of the Duchess she might have been, remarried to someone suitable, presiding over empty social functions, managing estates she never truly saw or understood. She thought of the comfort that path might have provided, the social acceptance that would have cushioned her days. Then she looked at Thomas, at the man whose love had awakened her conscience and whose partnership had transformed her from ornament to agent of change, and felt only gratitude for the courage that had led her to this moment. "I regret only the years I spent choosing wrongly," she said, lifting his calloused hand to her lips. "But perhaps those years taught me to recognize truth when I finally found it." Their daughter's delighted squeal drew their attention as she successfully captured a butterfly, holding it gently in her cupped palms before releasing it back to the sky. In that simple act of wonder and mercy, Eleanor saw the future they were building together, a world where strength served compassion, where justice grew from love rather than law, and where choices were made from conscience rather than convention. As evening painted the orchard in shades of gold and amber, Eleanor and Thomas walked hand in hand toward their home, their daughter riding high on Thomas's shoulders and chattering about butterflies and blossoms and all the wonders that awaited discovery. Behind them, the apple trees rustled with promise, their branches heavy with fruit that would feed not just the manor house, but every family on the estate. The sapphire necklace rested now in a place of honor in their bedroom, not as a symbol of inherited privilege, but as a reminder of the moment when choice triumphed over expectation, when love proved stronger than social convention, and when two people discovered that the greatest luxury was the freedom to build a life based on shared values rather than separate duties. In the distance, lights began to twinkle in cottage windows, each one representing a family whose circumstances had been transformed by the radical notion that prosperity should be shared by all who helped create it. And in the manor house on the hill, the Duchess of Whitmore sat down to dinner with her husband and child, knowing that she had finally found the life that had been waiting for her all along, not despite her choices, but because of them.